Since the beginning of the day, Ukrainian soldiers have repelled the most Russian assault attempts in the Pokrovsk direction. In this sector of the front, the enemy made 24 unsuccessful attempts to push the defenders from their positions.
The main thing is that the enemy still hasn't been able to achieve its main objectives for so long. Why is that? Obviously, well, on the one hand, and this is the first factor, it's the determined resistance of our defense forces. The armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces of Ukraine, are conducting a strategic defensive operation, the goal of which is precisely to disrupt the enemy's plans and turn them, on the contrary, in the opposite direction to defeat the enemy.
As noted by the National Guard of Ukraine, it is specifically in the Pokrovsk direction that there has been a significant increase in the use of drones by Ukrainian fighters. Overall, since the beginning of this year, the use of drones by the defense forces to repel Russian attacks in this sector of the front has increased by 70%. To prevent the enemy from entering our territory.
Preventing the enemy from entering our territory. We work both day and night to keep our skies free.
We're waiting for the order to take off.
We're waiting for the order to take off. As soon as we get the order, we'll take off right away and do our job.
The soldiers also note that they use captured Russian drones to destroy the enemy. The fighters repair these drones and send them back, this time against the occupiers. They say it's symbolic, to return the enemy's own death back to them. They managed to swap out the module.
The only thing we had to do was replace the module. We also basically changed the control system. We keep the flight camera, install our own initiation camera, and basically, we have a ready-to-use drone. We take their product, which they sent to us, but it didn't work. We just rework it and send it back. It's pretty cool, and I really like that kind of symbolism.
Ukrainian soldiers are also steadfastly holding the line in other directions. Specifically, 11 Russian attacks were repelled in the Novopavlivka sector, 12 in the Kramatorsk sector, 8 in the Lyman sector, and 5 in the Toretsk sector. 2 more assaults were repelled in the Kupiansk and Siversk directions, and 3 Russian attacks in the southern Slobozansk sector.
To the shooter. One hit.
Copy.
When the assaults were active, they were really putting on the pressure. There were days when you'd wake up in the morning without coffee and have to run for 40 minutes because a column of vehicles was coming. To the shooter.
In the northern Slobozansk and Kursk sectors, there have been 21 clashes since the start of the day. As military experts note, the Russians are trying to create some kind of filtration zone in northern Ukraine, but they're not succeeding.
To create such a zone, you'd need an order of magnitude more forces than what is currently deployed in the Sumy direction. Moreover, you might need the same number of troops as the entire Russian group that is currently fighting in Ukraine. So, it comes down to one of two things. Either the Russians are thinking about creating this zone, this dead zone, in the north of our country, or they're giving up on their main offensive in the east of our country. They simply don't have the resources to carry out 2 such large-scale operations.
According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total losses of the Russian Federation's army since the start of the full-scale invasion have exceeded 1,007,000 people. Just in the past 24 hours, Ukrainian forces have eliminated 1,040 Russian soldiers, destroyed 31 enemy armored vehicles and 37 artillery systems, shot down 184 drones, and struck 137 units of Russian army vehicles and special equipment.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Discuss the front with analyst Alexei Hetman. Alexei, hello.
Hello, Alexei.
Hello? Hello?
So, your analysis and your observations. Let's start with the Pokrovsk direction, one of the hottest spots. How is the tactic of the Russian occupiers changing there right now?
It hasn't changed significantly. We've been hearing about the Pokrovsk direction for at least a year now, actually, for more than a year. And basically, we're holding the defense there. Everything the Russians have managed to achieve since the start of their offensive operation, which they announced back at the end, well, in the fall of last year, for 2025, has just been reaching the Pokrovsk-Koshchentinivka highway. Beyond that, they haven't had any significant or even minor successes there. But again, anywhere from a third to half of all the combat clashes happening along the front line are taking place specifically in the Pokrovsk direction. Most likely, we can cautiously assume that the Russians will continue to use the Pokrovsk direction as their main axis, or at least one of the main ones. There can't be just one main direction there. During serious offensive operations, usually at least two are chosen, ideally 3 or 4. That's so the enemy can't concentrate in one place and hold the defense there. Especially since the Russians outnumber us, so they spread out, and we have to spread out too. But since there are fewer of us, our lines get thinner. But the main objective is most likely still to reach the border of Donetsk region, to fully control all of Donetsk region. And for that, including the North Slobozansky and South Slobozansky directions, well, the Kharkiv direction, and traditionally the Kharkiv and Sumy directions, and possibly there will be increased activity in the southern direction as well. That means the Zaporizhia direction and the Kherson direction. For now, yes, it's Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Koshchentinivka, Pokrovsk. These are the areas with the most intense fighting. And of course, there are already fewer and fewer panicked comments, especially from our foreign partners and media outlets, who used to say that the enemy was right on the doorstep and everything was going to be terrible. You know, any kind of event assessment is possible, but still, when information is being given, it should be based on something concrete. So I want to rely on what President Zelensky said 2 or 3 days ago, that the Russian advance has been halted in the Sumy direction and moreover, in some areas, well, in the northern Slobozansky region.
Yes, there's even a settlement that's been liberated. But let's go back to the Sumy direction now and talk about everything there. I'd actually like to spend a bit more time on Pokrovsk first. Since the beginning of the year, the use of drones by Ukrainian fighters in the Pokrovsk direction has increased by 70%. That's a pretty significant figure. This was reported by the National Guard of Ukraine in a comment to Liga. No. And the defense forces are ramping up their use of drones and, in some areas, have reached parity with the Russians. The commander of the National Guard, Oleksandr Yavanenko, confirmed that National Guard troops are successfully using drones to destroy enemy personnel as well as Russian weaponry.
We'll continue after the quote.
The expansion of capabilities in the use of unmanned systems continues. In particular, we are developing the use of fiber optic drones, expanding the deployment of strike UAVs such as Heavy Shot, Nemesis, and various modifications of FPV drones, all of which directly impact the rate at which enemy equipment, firepower, and artillery systems are destroyed. Oleksandr Pevnenko, Commander of the National Guard of Ukraine. Facebook.
You also mentioned that the enemy, the Russian occupiers, have chosen the Pokrovsk direction as one of the main areas for exerting pressure and reinforcing the situation there, right? How realistic is it for our enemy to further increase the pressure? And what is mainly preventing this from happening right now? Those same drones, the 70% increase in their use, that, as I already said, is quite a significant figure. What is it right now that is preventing our enemy from, let's say, putting even more pressure? Or do they simply not have the resources?
No, they just don't have the resources. If they could put more pressure here, they would. Or maybe they just don't want to. They want to capture Pokrovsk so gently this year, so they're being very careful. Well, there are those kinds of politicians.
But what's happening with Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk district? I wouldn't exactly call that gentle, let me tell you.
No, I just mean the reason they can't capture it. It's not because they don't want to, it's because they can't. If they could, they would have taken it. And about the National Guard, well, I'm a National Guardsman myself, and I don't know how drones operate in the armed forces of Ukraine. I mean, I don't know closely. But as for how they work in the National Guard, believe me, we started. The first pilots appeared even before the start of the full-scale invasion. guys from our battalion, they started. It was really hard to convince people that this was an important component, that drones would dominate, well, would play an important role. More precisely, not dominate, but play an important role in the upcoming war. The voice of the barrel. But back then, I don't want to mention the guys' call signs, they're my friends. They're still serving now. And it's been, 5 or 6 years since they started using drones as scouts, as, well, learning to pilot them. And their skill level is such that if I ever hear that some of our friends, even from NATO countries, try to teach our pilots how to operate drones, it would just make me laugh. Because these guys, their skill, as they say, is off the charts. So if the National Guard has started actively using drones, then I think that my brothers in arms, the ones who have been working in this field not for the first, second, third, or even fourth year, I think they should at least be officer instructors, and they should be the ones teaching others, those who have been mobilized, those who want to become drone pilots, because this is a very effective weapon. And I know these guys not just by hearsay. First of all, they are, very responsible, let's say. There's no fooling around there. Sure, you can joke around, chat in the smoking area, tell some anecdotes. But when it comes to business, like cleaning weapons, for example, or operating drones, people get very serious. They immediately become very focused and take it all very responsibly. So, well, I'll just say one thing. If Buddha is listening to me, I send my regards. My deepest respect to you, the specialists.
There's an interesting point regarding the Kursk operation by the Defense Forces. It's still ongoing. The General Staff is publishing maps and saying that yes, a small section of the Kursk region is still under the control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In particular, there's the settlement of Gavo, and there was also information about Tedkino. From a logistical standpoint, how justified is this right now? After all, we see that the Russians periodically launch Shahids and ballistic missiles from the Kursk region. By the way, according to the Ukrainian Air Force, missiles were launched from the Kursk region during the massive attack on Kiev a few days ago.
Yes, well, the day before yesterday. We control part of the Kursk region, but not all of it, of course. The enemy has brought up to 90,000 troops there, and they've managed to push us almost all the way back from our border. We control a small area, but we do control it. How justified is this? It's completely justified because for the Russians, it's not just a military issue, but also a very important political one that some of our troops are on the territory of the Russian Federation. By the way, they're not following their own law. The Law on War, or whatever its official name, is from 1996, which states, if enemy troops cross the border of the Russian Federation, they're supposed to declare, even the Duma hasn't approved it. Oh, I don't even remember the number of that law, but it should be checked. And that they are required to declare a state of war, to officially declare war on the side or group of countries that cross the border. The system of governance changes immediately in that case. That means it shifts, well, more towards the military, and they don't even follow their own laws. So believing that any agreements they sign with other countries, with us, maybe, or with America, with Turkey, I don't know who can be trusted. There's just no reason to believe that. That's why, politically, this is an important factor for them, and they're sending a large number of troops and equipment there to try to push us completely out of Russian territory. And that means these forces aren't being used, well, on the North Slobozhansk or South Slobozhansk fronts. So, well, these actions are completely justified.
Let's get back to the Sumy direction. You've already started to talk about it a bit. I'll just add some information for our viewers. Russia hasn't stopped trying to send small assault groups into the Sumy region. This was reported by the spokesperson for Ukraine's State Border Guard Service, Andriy Demchenko, during the Heidi and Inavani Marathon broadcast. But recently, the number of attacks has actually decreased, thanks to the defense forces constantly eliminating the occupiers. In addition, the Russian invaders have started using quad bikes and other motor vehicles less frequently. According to Demchenko, this shows that the Ukrainian armed forces are effectively countering Russian tactics in this sector of the front. In your opinion, what are the current objectives of the Russian occupiers specifically in this direction, and how achievable are they? Has our enemy's objective changed?
The objective hasn't changed. Their goal is to capture all of Ukraine or, at the very least, to advance as far as possible into our territory. The tactic of using small assault groups is more like. It's more like the work of sabotage and reconnaissance groups. And with small groups, it's simply impossible to seriously capture territory or make significant advances. A front line like the one in the Sumy direction is the kind of front that should be attacked by a division, or even several divisions, maybe even a corps. That's why the front line there should be up to 40 kilometers wide. The objective is to break through the defensive line somewhere along a 4 to 6 kilometer stretch and advance. That's the kind of objective set out in combat regulations. Russian military personnel aren't making things up. They fight according to protocols and also according to combat regulations. And using small assault groups is not a real offensive. A real offensive is something that should be carried out by a division or a corps. So, well, they're trying this. But you know, honestly, this is a bit of a stretch as a comparison. But it's more like a reconnaissance in force, because a real attack should be carried out by a much larger group and along a wide front, not by small groups trying to poke around here and there and then getting pushed back. So, most likely, the Sumy direction is more about politics again, just to scare everyone, to make it seem like if they really wanted to, they could just march right into Sumy. Although, honestly, no one was actually scared. Well, and maybe it's just a diversionary move after all. You know, let's be honest, we expected that when the Russians started their offensive actions, and we knew this offensive operation would take place in 2025, we thought it would most likely be in the Sumy or Kharkiv direction. Maybe Zaporizhia or Kherson as well. We thought that in Pokrovsk, it was just a diversion. They just want to distract our forces, not let us spread out. I mean, not to spread out, but to move our troops to the most dangerous direction. No, but as you can see, that's exactly what's happening so far. If, again, from a third to half of all combat encounters are happening in the Pokrovsk direction, then the priority of this direction, Pokrovsk, Kostantinivka, Myrnhrad, hasn't changed at all. And again, let's not resort to overly literary or artistic phrasing. The main strike, there are several directions for attacks, and that's at least 2, and well, usually no more than 5 are used. So 3 or 4 directions are usually used during serious, well, let's say, major offensive operations when the entire army is brought to the front line. That's usually 3 or 4 directions, rarely 5, and rarely just 2, never just 1.
In reality, all Russian actions in the Sumy direction are aimed at being a psychological pressure factor on Kiev as a whole.
Maybe.
As a political factor, so that in possible future negotiations they can get more for themselves. And as a distraction, to pull some of the defense forces away from other directions. And how long can they?
That's our Ukrainian assumption. That's what we assume. Basically, it's an assumption, yes. We have a pretty reasonable basis for our assumption. But again, it's nothing more than an assumption. Although, judging by the analysis, analyzing the situation, it's a fairly well-founded one. Let's put it that way. But it's not 100% certain that what we're saying, what we're assuming, is actually the case. Most likely it is. So you have to be careful here. I think you have to be careful with your words because, well, words are a weapon too.
It's just that if there aren't really huge ambitions there, like we might assume the opponent has, then basically, let's say, dragging out this situation, just annoyingly showing some activity there. You could keep doing that endlessly, it turns out.
No, look, Let's take the Wall Street Journal, Bild. These are respected publications. They said that they're advancing as fast as possible, comparing it to last November when they weren't moving at all. Well, naturally, even if you're moving very slowly compared to when you're standing still, everything seems faster than just standing. Well, this operation is just like it was in 2024, only compared to 2024.
Yes.
The Russians are advancing less and more slowly. In other words, the offensive operation is going worse than it did in 2024. So, expecting any kind of significant success, you could say, is not something the Russians should count on. And most importantly, there won't be in 26th. Why? Well, someone could just object, saying what? Like, in 2024 they advanced a little, in 2025 they'll advance some more, in 2026, 2027, so eventually they'll reach Lviv or Ivano-Frankivsk. They won't get there. According to the analysis of NATO military personnel, including European and American political scientists, economists, and military experts, in 2026 they won't have the capability to carry out an offensive operation like the one in 2024 or the one planned for 2025. Even Putin doesn't say that. They need to make one last push. But this is their swan song, their last chance. They've put everything on the line. Next year, if the war doesn't end this year and continues into the next, the Russians simply won't have the ability to launch offensive operations like they did in 2024 to 2025.
Let's talk about losses as well. How much mobilization potential does the Russian Federation have right now? And how well are they able to make up for their losses? After all, if we talk about the aforementioned Pokrovsk direction, Russian occupiers are being eliminated there by the hundreds every day.
Well, we already know the losses are over 1 million, and still, it hasn't really affected the Russians much. Their mobilization capacity is 30 to 35,000 per month, and they're losing 35 to 40,000. So if it's 35 and 35, it basically evens out. In other words, they can mobilize, or rather recruit, sign as many contracts as the number of people they're losing. On the one hand, that's frustrating. We keep hitting them, but the dragon's head just grows back again. But on the other hand, well, they can't increase the size of their forces, which means they definitely won't be able to change anything significantly. Not to mention that when it comes to heavy equipment, they're running a negative balance. In other words, they're losing more than they can produce, pull out of storage, or recover through repairs. Putin has already commented on this, saying that they plan to increase their mobilization capacity, their mobilization capabilities, to 50 to 60,000 per month. So almost double. Well, as well, these are pots. Because if you analyze what's happening in the Russian Federation with mobilization, well, not mobilization, but contract signings, there are far fewer people willing to sign contracts now than, for example, at the end of last year or the beginning of this year. This can be explained by the fact that everyone thought the war would end soon, and there was a one-time payout right away. You signed a contract. You immediately got a pretty substantial reward, well, a financial reward. And people went for it, thinking, well, we'll make some quick and easy money, as they say, and the war will end. Everything will be fine. We'll go and buy a lot of Kalina. But it turned out that nothing is actually ending.
It's not going to be easy. That's true.
It's not working out the easy way. That's why now there aren't so many people willing.
By the way, I think it's very appropriate to remind everyone that Russian soldiers can, in fact, surrender if their justifications for the war in Ukraine haven't worked out. And Ukraine fully complies with all conventions, all the rights of prisoners of war. That's actually, well, the only way out since.
Say this for Russians.
No one lets go.
For Russians. I have some special information for Russians. I know they watch your channel. Surrender. First of all the Geneva Conventions apply, meaning the Red Cross. You'll even get dental care if you want it. No problem. 3 meals a day, outdoor walks. And most importantly, if you surrender, we can give you a document during the exchange stating that you were captured in battle, not that you surrendered. so you can avoid criminal prosecution back in the Russian Federation.
Thank you for those very important remarks, Alexei. We're almost out of time for this broadcast, but I think we've covered the most important points for now. Alexei Hetman was with us, military analyst.